If anyone can hear this. I didn't mean to say it out loud. The words left Ethan Cole's lips in a low murmur, barely louder than the hum of failing systems. Yet they lingered in the cold air like something that refused to disappear. And for a moment he just stood there, listening to the station breathe around him, metal panels ticking as temperatures dropped, the faint vibration of distant engines echoing through the floor beneath his boots, minus 38 degrees outside the hull, and falling. According to the flickering display strapped to his wrist, not that it mattered, because no one was supposed to be here to hear him anyway, not on Outpost K-47, not after the evacuation order, not after the last shuttle burned out of orbit 3 weeks ago, leaving him behind with a toolbox, a failing reactor, and too many thoughts that wouldn't stay quiet unless he let them spill into the silence. So he talked, like he always did, to the walls, to the logs, to the empty corridors that stretched for miles like hollow veins through the station, power grids. Holding at 40%. He muttered, tapping the console with numb fingers. Oxygen stable, still smells like burnt wiring though. A dry laugh escaped him, the sound swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness. And for a second he closed his eyes, letting the cold bite at his skin, letting the quiet press in until it felt almost heavy, like something physical, something watching. But that was just the isolation talking. That was what happened when a man spent too long alone with machines and memories. You started to imagine things. You started to think the static in your headset wasn't just interference, that the extra flicker on your system logs wasn't just a glitch, and Ethan knew better. He did. He'd been trained for worse environments than this, trained to keep his head clear, to trust data over instinct. But the log on his wrist display blinked again, a small anomaly buried in lines of code. One extra signal that didn't match any of the station's known outputs, a faint echo of something that wasn't supposed to be there. He frowned, zooming in, breath slowing as he scanned it. That's not possible, he whispered, because the signal pattern wasn't mechanical, wasn't random noise. It had rhythm, a strange, organic cadence that didn't belong to any system he'd ever worked on. And before he could rationalize it away, before he could blame it on faulty sensors or his own exhausted mind, the lights in the corridor behind him dimmed just slightly, a subtle shift, like the station itself had exhaled, and Ethan felt it then, that quiet pressure again, stronger now, closer, not hostile, not aggressive, just present. He turned slowly, boots scraping against the metal floor, every instinct telling him he was about to confirm his worst fear or his deepest delusion. And there, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering overhead light, was a figure, motionless, almost blending into the shadows except for the faint glow that outlined her form, skin the color of deep ocean light, soft and luminous, as if it held its own quiet energy, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch, not cold, not distant, but aware, impossibly aware. And Ethan's mind scrambled for explanations. Hallucination, oxygen deprivation, stress-induced projection, anything that could make sense of what he was seeing, but none of it fit. None of it explained the way his heartbeat slowed instead of spiking, the way the silence around them felt suddenly shared, and when she tilted her head just slightly, a small, almost curious movement, and her lips curved into the faintest smile, she spoke, her voice calm, clear, and impossibly certain. You talk when you think no one is listening. And Ethan felt the world shift beneath him as she took a single step forward into the light and added, softly, I heard it all. The words did not echo, they settled, like they belonged there, and Ethan realized his mouth had gone dry before he even noticed he had stopped breathing, his fingers tightening around the edge of the console, as if the cold metal could anchor him to something real, something familiar, because nothing about this felt like a malfunction anymore. Nothing about her presence matched the flickering logic of a broken system, and yet his mind refused to accept anything else. That is not possible, he said, the sentence coming out slower than he intended, each word measured, controlled, the way he had been trained when things stopped making sense. There is no one else on this station. His eyes scanned her form again, searching for distortion, for the subtle warping that would reveal a projection, but she did not flicker, did not shift. The soft blue light along her skin remained steady, almost breathing, and when she took another step closer the temperature display on his wrist did something strange. It rose by 2 degrees, just enough for him to notice, just enough to feel the difference in the air against his face. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because machines did not do that by accident. And hallucinations did not change environmental readings. You are not alone, she said, her voice still calm, still certain, and it was not loud. It did not need to be. It seemed to arrive directly where it needed to, bypassing the empty space between them, and Ethan shook his head slightly, forcing himself to stay grounded. No, he exhaled, almost laughing but without humor. No, that is not how this works. He tapped the side of his wrist display, pulling up the station logs again, scrolling through the data as if numbers could restore order to. Whatever this was, I have been logging every system, every signal, every. His voice stopped when the anomaly line blinked again. That same pattern, steady now, synchronized in a way that made his chest tighten, because it was no longer random. It was responding, and slowly, almost against his own will, his gaze lifted back to her. That is you, he said, quieter this time. Not a question, not quite acceptance, but something in between, and for the first time her expression shifted just slightly. Not surprise, not amusement, but recognition, like he had finally reached a point she had been waiting for. You noticed, she said, and there was something in those words that felt warm, not in temperature, but in meaning, like approval without judgment, and Ethan took a step back before he even realized he was moving, his boots scraping against the floor. Stay where you are, he said quickly, instinct overriding confusion, because whatever she was, whatever this situation had become, distance still meant control, and control meant survival. But she did not advance, she simply stopped, exactly where she was, as if the concept of space between them mattered only because he believed it did, and that realization hit him harder than anything else so far, because it meant she was not reacting randomly, she was responding to him, to his thoughts, and the memory surfaced before he could stop it. Nights spent speaking into the empty corridors, words he never intended anyone to hear, things he barely admitted to himself, and his stomach tightened as he looked at her again, really looked this time. If you heard it all, he said slowly, carefully, then you heard things that were not meant for anyone. The silence stretched for a second, too, the station humming softly around them, and then she answered, not defensive, not intrusive, just honest. You wanted someone to hear you, and the simplicity of it cut through every layer of logic he had been building, because there was no accusation in her voice, no invasion, just a statement that felt uncomfortably true, and Ethan swallowed, his throat tight, his mind racing for a response that would put distance back between them, that would make this manageable again, but nothing came, because for the first time since he had been left on this station, the silence was not empty, and that terrified him far more than being alone ever had. The station did not feel empty anymore, and that was the problem. Ethan could feel it in the way his shoulders refused to relax, in the way his eyes kept tracking her even when she did not move, because silence used to belong to him. It used to be something he controlled, something he filled when he chose to speak, but now it felt shared, occupied, and he did not know the rules anymore. You should not be able to do that, he said finally, his voice lower now, steadier, as if grounding himself. In sound could rebuild the space between them. Hearing thoughts is not. That is not possible. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the motion automatic, familiar. Even if you could, you would not understand them. His eyes lifted to hers again, searching for confusion, for that disconnect that always existed between species, between languages. But she did not look confused. She looked patient, and that unsettled him even more, because patience meant time, and time meant she had been here longer than this moment, longer than he wanted to consider. You think your thoughts are hidden because you speak them softly, she said, her voice still carrying that same calm weight. But they are not quiet. Ethan frowned, a sharp crease forming between his brows. That does not make any sense, he replied, taking a small step to the side, creating a new angle, a new line of sight, as if changing position could change the reality in front of him. Sound needs air, it needs distance, it needs. He stopped himself, because the explanation felt weak even as he said it, and she watched him, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting him reach the edge of his own reasoning. And when he did, When the silence stretched again, she lifted her hand. Slightly, not reaching for him, not closing the distance, just acknowledging it. And the lights above them flickered once, twice, then steadied, and Ethan's wrist display blinked in response, the anomaly signal aligning perfectly with that moment, synchronized in a way that made his breath catch. "You are connected to the station," he said, the realization forming as he spoke it, each word pulling another piece into place. "That signal, the temperature shift, the systems reacting, that is you." His voice was quieter now, not afraid, but careful, like he was stepping onto something fragile, and for the first time, she nodded. A small, almost imperceptible motion, but it confirmed everything he needed to know, and everything he did not want to accept. "This place listens," she said, her gaze drifting briefly to the walls around them. The endless metal corridors, the cables humming behind sealed panels. "It carries your voice, your patterns, your feelings." She paused on that last word, as if choosing it carefully, and Ethan felt a strange tightness in his chest at the way she said it, like it mattered more than the rest. "I learned through it," she added softly, and the implication settled heavily between them, because it meant she had not just heard him once, not just in passing, but over time, over days, maybe weeks, every late-night thought, every quiet confession he had never intended to share. And his first instinct was to pull back, to shut down, to reclaim that privacy. But the station did not allow for that anymore. Not with her standing there. Not with the systems responding to her presence like she belonged. "So what are you then?" he asked, the question coming out more honest than he intended, stripped of deflection, stripped of control. Some kind of interface, a program, something that got loose. He almost laughed at that, because it sounded ridiculous even to him. But it was still easier than the alternative, easier than accepting that she was something entirely outside his understanding. And she tilted her head again, that same subtle motion, her expression thoughtful now. "I am not your system," she said gently, "and I am not lost." The words landed with quiet certainty, and Ethan felt something shift again, not in the station, not in the air, but in himself, because if she was not part of the station, and she was not an error, then she had chosen to be here, chosen to listen, chosen him, and that thought lingered longer than he wanted it to, settling into the silence that no longer felt empty, but waiting. The idea settled in slowly, heavier than anything else she had said, not because it was loud or overwhelming, but because it was quiet and deliberate, like something that had always been there waiting for him to notice, and Ethan felt his grip on certainty slip just a little more. "You chose to be here," he said, not as a challenge this time, but as a realization he could not quite push away. And the moment the words left him, the station lights dimmed again, just slightly, like a breath drawn inward, and her eyes remained on him, steady, unflinching. "Yes," she answered, and there was no hesitation in it, no ambiguity, just truth as simple as gravity. And that made his chest tighten in a way he did not expect, because choice meant intention, and intention meant purpose. And purpose meant he was no longer just a man alone fixing systems in the dark. He was part of something he did not understand. "Why?" he asked, the words sharper than he intended, edged with something between frustration and disbelief. "There is nothing here." He gestured around them, the empty corridor, the worn panels, the faint hum of a station barely holding together. No crew, no command, just a maintenance tech trying to keep the lights on. His voice dropped at the end, quieter, more honest than he wanted, and for a second he regretted saying it, regretted letting that truth slip out where she could hear it. But of course she already had, long before this moment, long before he even knew she existed, and she stepped closer then, not enough to invade his space, but enough that the soft glow of her skin touched the edges of his vision more clearly, casting a faint blue reflection across the metal walls, and the temperature rose another degree, subtle, but real. "You say there is nothing here," she said gently, "but you are here." And the simplicity of it caught him off guard again, because it was not dramatic, it was not profound in the way he expected, it was just direct. And Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, shaking his head slightly as if that could clear the weight building in his thoughts. "That is not a reason," he replied, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "People get left behind, systems fail, things happen, that does not make it important. The last word lingered, and he hated how uncertain it sounded, hated how it revealed more than he intended. And for the first time her expression shifted in a way he could not immediately read. Not curiosity, not patience, but something softer, something closer to understanding than observation. You measure importance by numbers, she said, her gaze flicking briefly to his wrist display. The blinking logs, the data streams he relied on. Population, signals, activity. She paused, then looked back at him. But you are wrong. And there was no judgment in it. No accusation, just a quiet correction that felt strangely grounding, and Ethan swallowed, his throat tight again, because part of him wanted to argue, to push back, to re-establish the logic that had kept him stable for weeks. But another part, a quieter part, the one that spoke when he thought no one was listening, recognized something in her words that he could not dismiss, and the station seemed to hum a little differently then, not louder, not stronger, but present in a way that mirrored the moment, like it was listening too. And that thought sent a brief chill through him despite the rising temperature. If you are not part of the system, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, and you are not lost, then what are you doing here? The question hung between them, heavier now, layered with everything that had come before, and she did not answer immediately. Instead her gaze softened just slightly, her head tilting in that familiar way, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but somehow more certain. I am listening, she said, and the words settled into the space between them like something final, something undeniable, and for the first time Ethan realized that whatever this was, whatever she was, it had never been about the station at all. It had always been about him. The word lingered longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was simple, and Ethan had spent weeks surrounded by systems that only responded to complexity, to commands, to measurable inputs. But this was different. This was just a statement. I am listening. And for a moment he did not know what to do with that, his mind reaching for something technical, something structured, anything that could turn her into a problem he could solve, because that was what he understood: broken circuits, failing relays, pressure leaks measured in decimals and warnings. But this was not broken, and that unsettled him more than any malfunction ever had. People do not stay just to listen, he said finally, his voice quieter now, less defensive, but still holding onto the last threads of logic he trusted. Not out here, not in a place like this. He gestured again, slower this time, as if even the motion had lost its urgency. There is nothing to gain. And the moment he said it, he realized how hollow it sounded. How much it echoed the same thoughts he had been repeating to himself every night just to justify why he kept going, why he kept fixing things that no one else would ever use. And she watched him as if she could see that realization forming before he fully understood it himself, her expression calm, but not distant, never distant. And that difference was starting to matter in a way he could not ignore. You measure gain by outcome, she said, softly, and the station lights responded again. A faint pulse along the corridor like a heartbeat he had never noticed before. But there is something else. She stepped just a little closer, not closing the space entirely, just enough that the air between them felt warmer, more present. Connection, she said, and the words settled differently than the others, heavier, more precise, like it belonged to something he had been avoiding naming. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly despite himself, because arguing against that felt pointless, not because she was overpowering him, but because she was not trying to. She was simply there. And for the first time since this started, he did not feel like he was being observed. He felt like he was being understood, and that realization brought with it something unfamiliar, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. You do not even know me, he said, but there was no sharpness in it now, just a quiet uncertainty, and she tilted her head again, that small, consistent motion that seemed to anchor her presence. I know the way your voice changes when you are tired, she replied. I know the pauses when you choose not to say what you are thinking. Her gaze held his, steady and clear. I know the silence you leave at the end of your sentences when you hope something will answer. And each word landed with a precision that made it impossible to dismiss, because they were true in ways he had never articulated, not even to himself. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest again. Not fear this time, but something closer to exposure, like standing in a light he did not realize he had been avoiding. "That is not the same as knowing someone," he said, but the argument felt weaker even as he spoke it, and she did not push back, did not correct him. She simply took another small step, close enough now that he could see the faint patterns in her skin, the subtle shifts of light that moved like reflections on water. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before, almost careful. "Then tell me," she said, and the simplicity of it stopped him completely, because for the first time since she appeared, she was not explaining, not observing, not stating what she already knew. She was asking, and the silence that followed felt different from all the others, not empty, not heavy, but open, waiting, and Ethan realized that whatever this was, whatever she was, this moment was not about being heard anymore. It was about whether he was willing to speak, knowing that someone truly was. The question stayed between them, not loud, not demanding, but impossible to ignore, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than thought. Somewhere instinctive, because this was not a system asking for input, not a protocol waiting for response. This was something else entirely, something that required a choice he had not prepared for. And for a moment he said nothing, his breath slow, visible in the cold air that no longer felt as sharp as before, his eyes drifting past her to the corridor behind, to the long stretch of empty metal that had been his entire world for weeks, a place where words meant nothing once they left his mouth, where silence always won. And now that silence was different, now it waited. And he realized that was what made this moment heavier than anything else, because if he spoke now, it would not disappear, it would not fade into static or get buried in logs. It would be heard, remembered, understood, and that made his chest tighten in a way he could not quite control. "You already know enough," he said finally. But the words lacked conviction, more reflex than truth, and she did not respond immediately, did not correct him, did not push. She simply remained there, steady, present, and that absence of pressure made it harder, not easier, because there was no resistance to push against, no reason to hold back except his own hesitation, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand dropping from the console, as if he was letting go of something he had been holding on to without realizing it. "I was not supposed to be here this long," he said, the sentence quiet, almost uncertain, like he was testing how it felt to say it out loud, and the station hummed softly around them, the sound filling the space without interrupting it. "They said it would be temporary, just maintenance, just a few weeks while they rotated crews." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly as the memory settled in. Then something changed, priorities shifted, resources got pulled, and suddenly this place stopped being important. His eyes flicked briefly to his wrist display, the blinking data, the steady decline of systems he kept fighting to stabilize, and I stayed. The words landed heavier than he expected, because they were simple, but they carried everything he had not said before, everything he had been avoiding even in his own thoughts. And she watched him, not with surprise, not with pity, just with attention, the kind that did not interrupt or judge, and that made it easier to continue. "At first it made sense," he went on, his voice steadier now, finding a rhythm he recognized. "Someone had to keep things running. Someone had to make sure the station did not fall apart completely. That is what I do. I fix things." He let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but softer. "That is what I told myself." And the silence that followed was not empty. It held the weight of that admission, the gap between what he said and what he felt, and he could feel it now, clearly, without the usual noise to bury it. But after a while, he hesitated, the words catching for a second, because this was the part he had never said out loud, not even when he thought no one was listening. "After a while I stopped fixing things because they needed to be fixed," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor, to the faint reflection of blue light around his boots. "I kept fixing them because if I did not, there would be nothing left to do." And that truth settled heavier than anything else, because it stripped away the last layer of justification he had been holding on to. And when he finally looked up at her again, there was no defense left in his expression, no distance, just honesty he had not allowed himself before, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her presence steady, unchanged, as if this was exactly what she had been waiting for, not the words themselves, but the moment he chose to say them. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than it had been since the beginning, almost gentle, You stayed because you did not want to disappear, she said, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not because she was revealing something new, but because she was giving shape to something he had never been able to name. And for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel like something he needed to fill. It felt like something he could stand in without being alone. The words stayed with him longer than the silence that followed, not fading, not dissolving into the background hum of the station, but anchoring themselves somewhere deeper, and Ethan realized he was still standing there, still facing her. Without the usual instinct to turn away, to retreat back into routine, and that alone felt like a shift he could not ignore. That is not. He started, then stopped, because denying it felt pointless now, like trying to argue against something he had already accepted without realizing it. And he let out a slow breath instead, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension eased out of them. Maybe, he said quietly, not fully agreeing, not fully resisting, just allowing the possibility to exist. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the station filling the space with its steady, mechanical rhythm, a low hum that had once been background noise, but now felt almost like a presence of its own, something that carried more than just energy through its systems. And Ethan found himself noticing things he had not before, the subtle shifts in light intensity along the corridor, the way the temperature display no longer fluctuated randomly, but seemed to stabilize around her presence, the faint synchronization between her movements and the system logs blinking on his wrist, and the realization formed slowly, not sudden, but undeniable. You have been here longer than today, he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful than reactive, and she met his gaze without hesitation, that same calm certainty in her expression. Yes, she answered, and this time the word carried more weight, more implication, because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand, and Ethan felt a strange mix of unease and clarity settle in his chest. How long? He asked, not because he needed the exact answer, but because the question itself mattered, because it defined the boundary of everything he thought he knew about his time here. And she tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to translate something that did not fit neatly into his way of measuring things. Long enough to hear you change, she said. And the response was not what he expected, not a number, not a duration, but something else entirely, something that made him pause, because it implied observation, continuity, presence over time in a way that felt personal, and Ethan frowned slightly, trying to piece it together. Change how? He asked, and there was no edge in his voice now, just genuine curiosity, and she answered without delay. At first, your voice was steady, she said, her gaze steady on him. You spoke in routines, in checklists, in tasks that needed to be completed. She paused briefly, as if recalling it. Then the pauses became longer, the sentences less certain. Her eyes softened just slightly. You began to ask questions you did not expect answers to. And Ethan felt that familiar tightness in his chest again. But it was different now, less defensive, more exposed, because hearing it reflected back to him made it real in a way it had not been before. And then, she continued, her voice quieter. You stopped expecting anything to answer at all. The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything else she had said, because they captured something he had not even realized had happened. The moment he shifted from speaking into silence to speaking despite it, and Ethan looked away briefly, his eyes tracing the worn edges of the corridor walls, the small imperfections he had memorized over weeks of isolation, and for the first time, they did not feel as empty as they once had. So you just listened, he said after a moment, the question softer now, almost reflective, and she nodded, a small, simple motion that carried more meaning than any explanation could. Yes, she said. I listened. And there was no elaboration, no justification, just the truth of it. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze returning to her, not searching this time, not analyzing, just seeing, and the distance between them felt different now, not something to maintain, not something to control, but something that no longer mattered in the same way, because whether she stood a few feet away or not, she had already been closer than anyone else could have been, and that realization did not bring fear this time. It brought something else, something quieter, steadier, like a presence he did not have to question anymore. And for the first time since she appeared, Ethan did not feel the need to fill the silence, because it no longer felt like something he had to survive. It felt like something he could share. The silence did not press against him anymore. It settled around him, steady and present, and Ethan found himself standing there longer than he intended, not because he was unsure, but because for the first time in weeks, he did not feel the need to move, and that alone was enough to make him uneasy in a different way. "So what happens now?" he asked, the question quiet, almost careful, as if saying it too loudly might break whatever this moment had become, and she did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting briefly past him, toward the corridor, toward the unseen systems that carried every sound, every signal through the station, and the lights responded again. A faint pulse that moved like a ripple along the walls, synchronized with something deeper than circuitry, something he could not quite define. And then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged but her presence somehow more anchored. "That depends on you," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that shifted responsibility in a way he was not used to, because out here, decisions had always been practical, measurable, tied to systems and outcomes. But this was not that. This was something else entirely, and Ethan frowned slightly, his instinct to analyze kicking in again, trying to frame it, to understand it in terms he could work with. "Depends on me how?" he asked, his voice steadier now, but still searching, and she stepped closer, just enough that the faint blue light from her skin reflected clearly in his eyes, and the temperature rose again, subtle but undeniable, and he realized it was no longer just the environment reacting, it was him too, his breathing slowing, his thoughts sharpening in a way that felt aligned. "You can return to your routines," she said, her tone calm, not dismissive, just factual. "Continue as you have been, speaking into silence, maintaining systems that no longer require you." Her gaze held his, not judging, just stating what he already knew. "Or," she added softly, and that single word carried more weight than the rest, "you can choose differently." And Ethan felt that shift again, not external this time, but internal, like a door he had not noticed before was now slightly open. And he exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting down to his hands, to the faint tremor he had not realized was there until now, not from cold, not from fatigue, but from something else, something unfamiliar. "Different how?" he asked, quieter now, and she did not answer with explanation, not directly. Instead she lifted her hand slightly, not touching him, not crossing that final space, just offering the possibility of it, and the station responded in that same subtle way, the hum deepening, the lights stabilizing, the anomaly signal on his wrist display aligning into a steady pattern that no longer looked like an error, but like something intentional, something alive, and Ethan stared at it for a second, the realization forming slowly. "You are connected to all of this," he said, more to himself than to her, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without needing to confirm it. And then she spoke, her voice softer than it had been before, but clearer, more direct. "I can leave," she said, and the words landed heavier than anything else, because they introduced something he had not considered, something he had not prepared for. "This place does not hold me," she continued, her gaze steady. "I stayed because you were here." And Ethan felt his breath catch, just slightly, because that shifted everything, because it meant her presence was not fixed, not permanent, not something he could adapt to over time like the systems around him. It was a choice, her choice, and that meant it could end just as easily. And for a moment he said nothing, his mind searching for the right response, the logical one, the safe one, but nothing came, because this was not about logic anymore, and the silence stretched again, but it did not feel empty. It felt like a threshold, something waiting to be crossed. And when he finally looked up at her, really looked this time, there was no analysis left in his gaze, no attempt to categorize or define, just a quiet understanding of what was being offered, and what could be lost. And for the first time since she appeared, Ethan realized that being heard was not the most important part of this. It was what came after, the choice to answer, or to let the silence return to what it used to be. The words stayed in the air between them, not fading, not dissolving into the quiet hum of the station, and Ethan realized he had not moved, not even a step, as if the entire corridor had narrowed down to this one moment, this one decision. And for the first time since he had been left here, The future did not feel like something distant or inevitable. It felt immediate, fragile, dependent on what he said next, and that alone made his chest tighten in a way he could not ignore. "You can leave," he repeated, his voice lower now, slower, as if testing the weight of it, and she watched him without interruption, her expression unchanged but her presence steady, like she was not waiting for a specific answer, only for him to reach one. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting past her again, down the length of the corridor, to the familiar lines of metal and light that had defined his world for weeks. And for the first time, he saw it differently, not as something stable, not as something that would always be there, but as something that had only ever existed because he stayed, because he chose to keep it running. And that realization shifted something in him, something subtle but undeniable. "If you leave," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, more honest than before, "then it goes back to how it was." He did not need to explain what that meant, not to her, not anymore, because she already knew. She had heard it in every late-night sentence, every unfinished thought, every pause that stretched too long, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without saying it. And the station seemed to hold its breath with him, the hum softening, the lights steady, as if everything was waiting for what came next. And Ethan looked down at his wrist display, at the anomaly signal that was no longer an error, no longer something to fix, but something that had become part of his reality, something he could not categorize or remove. And slowly, he lowered his hand, letting the display dim, letting the data fade into the background for the first time since this began. "I spent weeks talking to nothing," he said, the words quiet, but clear, convincing myself it did not matter if anyone heard me. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly as the truth of it settled in, that it was enough just to keep going. And he shook his head once, a small motion, but it carried more weight than anything else he had done so far. But it was not. The admission hung there, simple and undeniable, and when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left in his gaze, no attempt to distance himself from what he was about to say. "So if you can leave," he continued, his voice steady now, grounded in something deeper than logic, "then stay." And the word landed differently than anything else, not a request, not a command, but a choice, his choice. And the moment it was spoken, the station responded in a way he had not felt before, not with flickers or fluctuations, but with a quiet stabilization, like something had aligned, like a system had found its balance. And the temperature held steady, the hum consistent, the lights clear and unwavering. And she watched him, her expression shifting just slightly, something softer, something almost relieved, though it was subtle enough that he could not be sure. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something warmer. "You are choosing to be heard," she said, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing in a way he had not expected, because for the first time, that did not feel like a vulnerability. It felt like something stronger, something deliberate, and he shook his head slightly, a faint, almost tired smile touching his expression. "No," he said, his voice calm, steady. "I am choosing to listen back." And the silence that followed was not empty, not waiting. It was full, shared, and for the first time since the station had gone quiet, it felt like something alive. The station did not feel like a machine anymore. It felt like something holding its breath, steady and aware, and Ethan stood in that stillness with a sense of clarity he had not felt since before the evacuation, before the long stretch of empty days blurred together into routine. And for the first time, the systems around him did not feel like something he had to fight to maintain. They felt responsive, as if the choice he had made had changed more than just the moment between them. And he noticed it in the smallest details, the way the overhead lights no longer flickered at irregular intervals, the way the low hum of the reactor carried a consistent rhythm, the way the temperature display on his wrist held steady at a level that was no longer just survivable, but almost comfortable. And he exhaled slowly, letting that realization settle. "That is new," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and she watched him, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way the light around her moved, softer now, less like an outline and more like something integrated into the space itself. "You are noticing differently," she replied, and Ethan let out a faint breath that almost became a laugh, not because it was amusing, but because it was true in a way he could not deny. Maybe, he admitted, his voice calm, his thoughts no longer racing to categorize or control, and for a moment they stood there without speaking, the silence no longer something to fill, but something to exist within. And then the station broke it, not with sound, but with data, his wrist display blinking suddenly with a new notification, a signal spike that did not match any of the patterns he had been tracking. An instinct returned immediately, sharp and focused, his hand lifting to the display, his eyes scanning the incoming data. "That is not internal," he said quickly, his voice shifting into the familiar cadence of analysis. "That is external." And his gaze moved past her, toward the far end of the corridor, as if he could see through layers of metal and vacuum to whatever source had triggered the alert. "There should not be any incoming transmissions," he added, more to himself than to her, because the station had been silent for weeks, no contact, no signals, nothing but the steady decay of unused systems, and yet the data in front of him was clear, structured, intentional. "It is not random," he said, his brow furrowing slightly. "It is targeted." And the word hung there, heavy with implication, and for the first time since she appeared, Ethan felt something shift back toward uncertainty, not fear, not panic, but awareness of something outside this contained moment, something approaching, something real in a way that could not be ignored. And he glanced at her, searching her expression for any sign of reaction, any indication that she understood what this meant, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her calm unchanged. But her eyes held something deeper now, something that mirrored the gravity of the moment. "They have found you," she said softly, and the words landed with quiet certainty, and Ethan felt his chest tighten, not because he did not understand, but because he did, because they could only mean one thing. The people who had left, the system that had deemed this place no longer important, and now, suddenly, there was a signal, a return, and the timing of it pressed against his thoughts in a way he could not ignore. "Why now?" he asked, the question more to the situation than to her, but she answered anyway, her voice steady, grounded. "Because you are no longer invisible," she said, and Ethan felt that shift again. Deeper this time, because he understood what she meant, not just in terms of signals or systems, but in something else, something that had changed the moment he chose to be heard, to listen, to exist beyond the quiet routine he had built to survive, and the station seemed to respond to that realization, the hum deepening slightly, the lights holding steady, as if whatever was coming, whatever signal had found him, it was arriving to a place that was no longer empty, no longer silent, and for the first time, Ethan realized that this was not just about being found, it was about what he had become in the process of no longer being alone. The signal did not fade. It stabilized, repeating in a clean, deliberate pattern that cut through the station's quiet like something that had purpose, and Ethan felt his focus sharpen instantly, the familiar rhythm of analysis returning. But this time it did not feel like escape, it felt like choice, and his fingers moved across his wrist display with practiced precision, pulling up deeper layers of data. "Frequency is consistent," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Signal strength increasing by 0.3% every second." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as the numbers aligned into something undeniable. "They are locking onto the station." And the realization settled in his chest, not as panic, but as weight, because this was no longer isolation, no longer abandonment. This was contact, and contact meant decisions that would not disappear into silence. And he glanced at her again, not searching this time, but including her in the moment without thinking about it. "If they are scanning, they will see the systems are active," he said, his voice steady, grounded in the logic he trusted. "They will know someone is still here," and the implication hung between them, clear and unavoidable, and she did not react with urgency or concern. She simply watched him, her presence steady, as if this moment was not unexpected. "They will want to take you back into silence," she said softly, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because that was exactly how it would be framed, a retrieval, a correction, a return to protocol, and for a brief second, the old instinct surfaced, the one that said this was what he had been waiting for. Rescue, reintegration, an end to the isolation that had defined his days. But that instinct did not hold the same weight anymore. It did not feel like relief. It felt incomplete, and he exhaled slowly, his eyes returning to the display, watching the signal grow stronger, more precise. "They are not coming for me," he said after a moment, the realization forming as he spoke it. "They are coming for the station." His gaze flicked briefly to the surrounding systems, the stabilized lights, the steady hum that now felt almost alive. "For the data, the infrastructure, whatever they think is still useful." And the words felt colder than he expected, because they stripped away the idea of being missed, of being remembered, leaving only function, only value measured in systems and output. And for the first time, that perspective felt small, limited in a way he could now see clearly. And she tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "And you?" she said. "What are you now?" The question was simple, but it carried more weight than anything else in the moment, because it cut through the external situation and brought him back to the choice he had just made, the one that had changed everything. And Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes drifting once more down the corridor, to the place that had been empty, to the place that was no longer, and he realized that whatever came next, whatever signal was approaching, whatever decision he would have to make, it was not about being taken or left behind anymore. It was about whether he would allow himself to disappear again. And slowly, he lowered his wrist display, letting the signal continue without constant monitoring, a deliberate act that felt almost symbolic. And when he looked back at her, his expression was calm, grounded in something that had not been there before. "I am here," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than any explanation could, because it was not about location, not about the station, it was about presence, choice. And she held his gaze for a moment, her eyes reflecting that understanding without needing to say it, and the station hummed softly around them, steady, alive, as the signal continued to grow closer. And for the first time, Ethan did not feel like something waiting to be found. He felt like something that had already chosen to exist. The signal grew stronger, no longer a distant pattern buried in data, but a presence that could be felt in the rhythm of the station itself, steady and approaching. And Ethan stood in the corridor with a clarity that no longer wavered, his breath slow, controlled, his thoughts no longer scattered between survival and doubt, but focused, grounded in something he had chosen. And for the first time, the incoming transmission did not feel like an answer to isolation. It felt like a question, one that demanded more than instinct, more than protocol. And he lifted his wrist display again, not with urgency, but with intention, scanning the signal as it resolved into structured data, recognizable now, encoded in standard human transmission format. "It is a retrieval directive," he said quietly, the words carrying no surprise, only confirmation, automated, high priority, no crew signature attached. His eyes moved across the lines of code, reading between them, understanding what was not being said as clearly as what was. "They are not sending people," he added. And that realization settled heavier than expected, because it meant there would be no voices, no faces, no acknowledgement, just a system reclaiming what it deemed valuable, and leaving the rest behind without hesitation. And Ethan lowered the display slowly, letting the information sit without reacting to it, because this time, he did not feel pulled by it, did not feel defined by it. And when he looked at her, his expression remained calm, steady, as if the presence beside him mattered more than the signal ahead. "If they take control of the station, they will overwrite everything," he said, his voice measured, not alarmed, just clear. "Power routing, system access, communication channels." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "You." And the word lingered, not as a technical concern, but as something more, something that could not be reduced to data or function. And she did not step back, did not shift. She remained exactly where she was, her presence as steady as the station itself had become. "I am not stored here," she said softly, and the certainty in her voice did not dismiss his concern, it reframed it. "But I am connected," she added, and Ethan understood immediately what that meant, not in terms of hardware or systems, but in terms of presence, of choice, of the way she had intertwined with this place and with him. And the implications settled between them, clear and unavoidable. If the station changed, if the systems were taken, Then the space that had allowed this connection to exist would change with it. And for a moment, the old instinct returned, the one that said this was beyond his control, that systems like this could not be resisted, that protocol would always override individual action. But that instinct did not hold the same authority anymore, not after everything that had shifted, not after he had chosen to be present instead of invisible. And he exhaled slowly, his hand lowering from the display completely now, leaving the signal to continue without constant monitoring. And the act felt deliberate, like stepping away from something that no longer defined him. "Then I do not let them take it," he said, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried a weight that came from certainty, not reaction. And for a moment the station seemed to respond, the hum deepening slightly, the lights holding steady, as if the decision itself had reinforced something within its structure. And she watched him, her gaze steady, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, not just understanding, but recognition, like he had crossed a threshold she had been waiting for. "You would choose this," she said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I already did," he replied, and the simplicity of it carried everything that had changed, everything that had led to this moment. And the signal continued to grow, closer now, more defined. But for the first time, it did not feel like something approaching to take control. It felt like something that would have to meet him where he stood, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was steady, shared, and unbroken as the future closed in around them. The signal reached full strength, no longer a distant presence but a clear, structured directive pressing against every system in the station. And Ethan could feel it now, not just through the data on his display, but through the subtle tension in the air, the way the station's hum held steady as if bracing for impact. And he stood there without moving, without reaching for controls or overrides, because this moment was not about reacting anymore. It was about holding the line he had chosen. And the lights above remained constant. No flicker, no distortion, just a quiet, unwavering glow that reflected faintly in her blue-lit form beside him. And for a moment, everything felt suspended between two outcomes, one that would reduce this place back to function and silence, and one that would preserve what had been created here, something that could not be measured or stored. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his posture grounded, and he did not look at the signal again. He did not need to, because he already understood what it represented, and more importantly, what it did not. "They will attempt to access core systems in 10 seconds, he said calmly. The information already calculated, already processed, but his voice did not carry urgency, only awareness, and she remained beside him, her presence unchanged, not resisting, not interfering, just there. And that was enough, because he was no longer acting alone, even if no one else would ever understand that. And the countdown passed not as numbers on a screen, but as a quiet shift in the station's rhythm, a subtle pressure against its systems, like something knocking from the outside, requesting entry. And Ethan felt it, the way the station responded, not rejecting, not accepting, just holding, waiting. And he closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to center himself in the moment, to feel the difference between what this place had been and what it had become. And when he opened them again, his gaze was steady, clear, and he spoke, not to the system, not to the signal, but into the space between himself and her. "You said this place listens," he said quietly, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth of it. And Ethan took a slow breath, then spoke again, not as a command, not as a function, but as something else entirely, something intentional. "Then hear this," he said, his voice firm but calm, carrying through the corridor, through the walls, through every system that had once simply echoed his loneliness. "This station is not empty." And the words settled into the structure around him, not fading, not dissolving, but anchoring. And for a moment, nothing happened. The signal continued to press. The systems remained steady. And then, slowly, something shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that could be felt. The station's hum deepened, aligning into a resonance that matched his voice, his presence, as if it had chosen to recognize him, not as a user, not as a technician, but as something more. And the incoming directive faltered, just slightly, its pattern disrupted not by force, but by something it could not categorize, could not override, and Ethan felt it, the difference. The subtle refusal of the system to yield completely, and he let out a quiet breath, not in relief, but in understanding, because this was not about winning or stopping anything. It was about standing, about existing in a way that could not be erased by protocol, and beside him, she watched, her expression softer than it had ever been, and for the first time, there was something like quiet approval in her gaze, not for what he had done, but for what he had become, and the signal continued. Still present, still pressing, but no longer absolute, no longer defining the space, and the station remained steady, alive in a way that could not be measured in data alone, and Ethan stood there, not as someone waiting to be taken, not as someone left behind, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and in the silence that followed, there was no emptiness, only a quiet, shared presence that did not need to speak to be understood.